The shell that destroyed HMS Hood never actually hit her. It missed by about 20 feet. And in the next 3 minutes, the largest warship in the British Navy split in two and disappeared. 1,415 men went down with her. 22 years earlier, someone in the Admiralty had already predicted it. Hood was commissioned in May 1920. At 860 feet long and around 42,000 tons fully loaded, she was the largest warship in the world and remained so for 2 decades. 8 15-inch guns. A main waterline belt of 12 inches of angled steel. 32 knots on trials. The Royal Navy called her a battlecruiser. The type traded some protection for speed. Hood was better protected than most accounts suggest, but there was one specific path through her defenses that her designers had identified before she ever sailed. A path that, given the right shell and the right conditions, led directly to her magazines. In 1919, the Admiralty ran live firing trials against a mock-up of Hood's armor using 15-inch armor-piercing capped shells. The results were documented in Admiralty Record ADM 19226, dated 26 September 1919. The conclusion was unambiguous. A 15-inch shell could penetrate Hood's vitals via the 7-inch middle belt and the slope of the main deck and reach the magazines. The Admiralty responded. 3 inches of additional plating were added above the magazine spaces. 4 5.5-inch guns were removed to compensate for the weight. The board proposed going further, raising the magazine armor to 6 inches over the rear and 5 inches over the front. It would have required months of additional work. Hood was almost done. The Royal Navy needed her. The deeper fix was deferred, and so she entered service and became what she became: the mighty Hood, the most recognized warship on the planet. For a generation, she was the thing the Empire pointed to when it needed to remind someone that it was still the Empire. But the 1919 document existed. The path to the magazines had been drawn, and across the 22 years between her commissioning and the Denmark Strait, the problem it described was studied, acknowledged, partially addressed, and never fully solved. The historian William J. Durrance, a member of the Marine Forensics Committee of the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers, described those 1919 Admiralty diagrams in his 1987 analysis published in Warship International as almost incredibly prophetic. They sketched the exact path. They showed where the shell would go. This is not a story about a lucky shot. London, a conference room. Hood had been at sea for 18 years. She had traveled the world. She had shown the flag everywhere the flag needed showing. She had served in the Mediterranean, covered operations off the French coast, and been kept in near constant deployment because she was the ship the Royal Navy could not afford to have in dry dock. That deployment had cost her. By the late 1930s, her machinery was in serious condition. Her condensers were so deteriorated that much of the output from her freshwater evaporators had to go into replenishing the boiler feed water rather than to the crew. In cold weather, steam pipes were too leaky to heat the mess decks. Her crew could not reliably bathe with the water that was available to them. A bomb hit from a Junkers Ju-88 in September 1939 damaged her port torpedo bulge and her condensers further. By early 1940, her best speed had been reduced to 26.5 knots, more than 5 knots below what she had achieved on trials. The crew had a nickname for her: the largest submarine in the Navy. In late 1938, Captain Walker and his officers sat down with the Director of Naval Construction and itemized what Hood needed. The plan was given a name: the Large Repair. The Large Repair, documented in Admiralty Record ADM 22920, was comprehensive. New machinery, new boilers, improved deck armor over the vital areas, raised from 3 inches to 5 inches above the magazines, restructured torpedo bulges. The estimated cost was £4.5 million. The estimated duration was 2 to 3 years. It was scheduled to begin in spring 1942. The engineers who drew up that plan had the 1919 documents. The 5-inch magazine armor upgrade they were proposing was a direct response to what ADM 19226 had found 20 years before. They knew what the problem was. They had known since before Hood was commissioned. The Large Repair would have fixed it. September 1939. Britain went to war. You could not remove the most famous capital ship in the Royal Navy from service for 3 years at the start of a war. The Large Repair was postponed, then postponed again. Everything was in place. Hood just did not know what everything was building toward. May 19, 1941. The German battleship Bismarck departed Gotenhafen, now the Polish city of Gdynia, under the command of Admiral Gunther Lutyens. Her orders were to break into the Atlantic and attack Allied merchant shipping. Avoid the Royal Navy. Bismarck was 20 weeks into her first operational deployment. She was fast, modern, and equipped with fire control systems that could accurately engage targets at over 36,000 yards. Hood's maximum effective range was roughly 29,000 yards. That range in naval gunnery is the difference between being able to hit something and not. The British tracked Bismarck's departure through a report from a Swedish cruiser, confirmed by aerial reconnaissance over Bergen. 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk, were sent to the Denmark Strait to shadow the Germans. A second group, HMS Hood and the brand new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, was ordered to intercept. Prince of Wales was so new that Vickers Armstrong contractors were still on board trying to fix problems with her main gun turrets when she sailed for battle, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly badly planned. The man commanding both ships from Hood's Bridge was Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland. He was 54 years old, methodical by reputation, and operating under a fleet command culture that rewarded aggression. He knew Hood's vulnerabilities. He had read the engineering assessments. What he had to weigh against them was the operational reality. Bismarck was in the Denmark Strait and had to be stopped before she reached the Atlantic. By the morning of May 24, 1941, Norfolk and Suffolk had found Bismarck and were shadowing her, relaying her position. Hood and Prince of Wales closed at high speed. At 5:35 a.m., the Germans were sighted from Hood. The range was approximately 35,000 yards. Bismarck was sailing roughly northwest. Holland was closing on an intercept heading that meant only Hood's forward turrets could bear on the enemy. Her aft turrets were masked by the angle of approach. Bismarck could reply with her full broadside. Holland knew this. His response was to accelerate. Every knot of speed reduced the range. At closer range, Bismarck's shells would arrive at a flatter angle. Flatter angle meant less risk to Hood's deck. He was trying to race through the zone where Hood's deck armor was most vulnerable. This decision, made with full knowledge of Hood's weaknesses, had a flaw. Hood's designers had not fully anticipated. That flaw would come back to determine the outcome of the battle. At 5:52 a.m., Holland ordered Hood to open fire. The first British salvos were directed at the lead German ship. But in the flat grey light of the Arctic morning, with both German vessels in near identical silhouettes, the British had targeted Prinz Eugen, the heavy cruiser sailing ahead of Bismarck. The first salvos went at the wrong ship. Several minutes of valuable gunnery time went with them before the correction was made. The Germans did not immediately return fire. Lutyens was under standing orders to avoid contact with British capital ships. His first gunnery officer, Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schneider, was pressing for permission to engage. The permission came late. When it came, Schneider's gunnery was exact from the first salvo. 6 a.m. Both sides were firing. The range had closed to 16,500 yards, roughly 9 miles. At 5:55 a.m., a shell from Prinz Eugen struck Hood's boat deck near the base of the mainmast. A fire broke out in the 4-inch ready-use ammunition lockers. Captain John Leach of Prince of Wales, watching from a distance of less than a mile, later described the fire in his testimony to the Board of Inquiry as something resembling a vast blow lamp. On Hood's compass platform, ordinary signalman Ted Briggs was at his station. He was 18 years old. He had joined the Royal Navy on March 7, 1938, 1 week after his 15th birthday, assigned to Hood after completing his training at HMS Ganges. He had first seen Hood when he was 12, anchored in the River Tees near his hometown of Redcar in Yorkshire. He had walked home that day and told his family he was going to be in the Navy. He had to wait 3 years to be old enough to apply. When the assignment to Hood came through, it was the ship he had been waiting for. That morning, Briggs watched Bismarck fire. He later described seeing what appeared to be 4 incandescent stars appear along the length of the German ship, which he recognized as shells in flight. Bismarck's first salvo fell short. Her second went over. Her third hit. The boat deck fire continued. Men on Prince of Wales thought it might be dying down. Holland ordered the turn to port that would bring Hood's aft turrets into action. The range was now inside 16,500 yards. The aft guns were almost in position. Then Bismarck's 5th salvo arrived. Captain Leach testified to the Board of Inquiry that he observed 2 or 3 shells fall in the vicinity of Hood's mainmast. Then, in his words, a very fierce upward rush of flame, the shape of a funnel, a rather thin funnel, and almost instantaneously the ship was enveloped in smoke from one end to the other. What happened after that lasted 3 minutes. On Hood's compass platform, Ted Briggs felt a blinding flash sweep the outside of the platform. He was lifted off his feet. When he steadied himself, the ship was already listing to starboard. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, then back. Then it rolled to port and did not stop. At 30 degrees, Briggs understood she was not coming back. He moved for the ladder off the compass platform. The ship was nearly on its side. At the top of the ladder, he came to Commander John Warrand, 37 years old, the squadron's navigating officer. Warrand was blocking the exit. He looked at Briggs. Then he stepped aside, gestured for him to go first, and waited. Briggs went down. The sea was already at his legs. When Hood completed her role, the suction dragged him under. He stopped struggling at some depth he could not measure. He was prepared to die. And then, something, almost certainly, air escaping from the collapsing structure, blasted him back to the surface. 3 men survived. Ted Briggs, 18 years old, compass platform. Able seaman Robert Tilburn, 20 years old, who had been at his gun station on the boat deck. Midshipman William Dundas, 19 years old, who had been with Briggs on the compass platform. They were rescued about 3 hours later by HMS Electra. 1,415 men were lost. Vice Admiral Holland was last seen sitting in his admiral's chair on the compass platform, making no attempt to leave. Commander Warrand was never seen again. What happened next still does not fully make sense. 3 separate boards of inquiry would try to explain it. None of them could. The first board of inquiry was convened within days, chaired by Vice Admiral Sir Geoffrey Blake. Its conclusion: the sinking of Hood was due to a hit from Bismarck's 15-inch shell in or adjacent to Hood's 4-inch or 15-inch magazines, causing them all to explode and wreck the afterpart of the ship. The probability is that the 4-inch magazines exploded first. The Director of Naval Construction, Sir Stanley Goodall, was not satisfied. He pointed out that the explosion had been observed near the mainmast, 65 feet further forward from where the aft magazines were actually located. A second board was convened under Rear Admiral H.T.C. Walker, who had himself once commanded Hood. Then a third. All 3 reached the same general conclusion: a 15-inch shell from Bismarck. The aft magazines. The 4-inch magazines probably first. None of them could say exactly how the shell got there. The most popular explanation in books and documentaries from the 1940s onward was plunging fire. Bismarck's shells, falling in a steep arc from long range, had pierced Hood's deck armor from above. It had happened to British battlecruisers at Jutland in 1916. It seemed to fit. William J. Jurens, in his 1987 analysis for the International Naval Research Organization, ran the numbers on that theory. At a range of 16,500 yards, Bismarck's 15-inch shells were not following a steep arc. The angle of fall was approximately 14 degrees from horizontal. Jurens calculated that 14 degrees was so unfavorable to horizontal armor penetration that it was literally off the scale of contemporary German penetration charts. A shell falling at 14 degrees at that range would not have penetrated Hood's deck armor with sufficient force to reach the magazines. The plunging fire theory has appeared in print and on screen for 80 years. It is almost certainly wrong. The second theory involved Hood's own torpedoes, stored in tubes on her upper deck. A hit near those tubes could have set them off. The second board of inquiry tested this. A 15-inch shell landing near a torpedo would not detonate it by concussion. A fire might eventually cause a detonation, but only after more than 20 minutes of sustained burning, and the explosive force of a single torpedo warhead would not reach the aft magazines located 2 decks below and 25 meters further aft. The torpedo theory was set aside. The third theory was the one that could not be disproved: the anti-flash protocols. After Jutland, the Royal Navy introduced strict procedures against magazine fires. Hatches sealed. Powder stored only inside armored magazines. Nothing loose in the handling rooms during action. The theory was that Hood's crew, in the heat of battle, had relaxed those procedures. Hatches open. Powder bags outside the magazines. A flash from the gun, or a misfire finding a path to the cordite. There are no survivors from Hood's gun turrets. It cannot be confirmed. It cannot be ruled out. But all 3 of those theories assumed something that deserved more scrutiny than it received: that the shell had passed through Hood's armor to get to the magazine. Hood was traveling at roughly 28 knots when she was hit. At 28 knots, a ship 860 feet long creates a bow wave with a specific geometry. The wave breaks at the bow, generates a trough along the midship section, and then rises again. The position of that trough along the hull is determined mathematically by the ship's speed. At 28 knots, for a ship of Hood's length, the trough of the bow wave fell in a precise location on her starboard hull, in the region of X-turret and the main mast, directly above the 4-inch magazine and the 15-inch handling room. Photographs of Hood taken in the Mediterranean in 1937, while she was at speed in a turn, make this visible. The black stripe marking the waterline runs consistently across most of the hull. But in the section above her aft magazines, a band of steel that would normally be below the waterline is exposed to open air. The 12-inch lower belt ends. Below it, ordinary hull plating. On the morning of May 24th, Hood was in the middle of a turn to port when the 5th salvo arrived. The wreck confirmed this. The rudder was found in an off-center position consistent with an incomplete port turn. A ship turning to port heels to starboard. The heel deepens the trough on the starboard side, the side facing Bismarck. At 28 knots, in the middle of an incomplete port turn, the exposed section of unarmored hull above the aft magazines was on the Bismarck-facing side of the ship. Jurins calculated that a shell falling approximately 20 feet short of Hood's hull could have struck the water, angled down, and hit that exposed steel directly. No passage through the main armored belt. Impact on unarmored hull plating. Kinetic penetration into the 4-inch magazine. Standard fuse delay. Detonation inside the magazine, feeding to the 15-inch magazine. This was not without precedent. On that same morning, in the same engagement, a 38-centimeter shell from Bismarck penetrated Prince of Wales below her waterline and under her armored belt. It passed through the hull plating and drove through 4 steel bulkheads before stopping in the keel. It was a DUD. When Prince of Wales reached dry dock, they found the shell. It had traveled more than 8 meters below the waterline. Had it been a live round, in line with Prince of Wales magazines, 2 ships would have vanished in the Denmark Strait that morning. The 1919 Admiralty diagrams were not wrong. They showed exactly the path a shell could take through the 7-inch middle belt to the magazine. What they could not anticipate was the trough, Hood's own speed on her own final approach removed the belt from the equation entirely. The large repair, the one documented in Admiralty File ADM2 2920 and priced at £4.5 million, had targeted the right problem. 5 inches of deck armor above the magazines would have withstood the hit at that range, according to subsequent analysis. But the shell Jurens described did not go through the deck. It went under the belt. The repair addressed what the 1919 tests had found. The thing that actually killed her was something neither document had anticipated. The Royal Navy had been trying to protect Hood for 22 years. They identified the right problem in 1919. They designed the right repair in 1938. They ran out of time both times. On May 24, 1941, they ran out of time a third time. In July 2001, a team led by Marine surveyor David Mearns found Hood's wreck in the Denmark Strait, 9,200 feet below the surface. In August 2015, working from Paul Allen's research vessel, the same team recovered her bell. The bell Lady Hood had carried from one warship to another. The bell with 2 inscriptions, one mentioning her husband killed at Jutland when his battlecruiser's magazines exploded, the other recording her gift of it to the ship she launched in his memory. It was unveiled at the National Museum of the Royal Navy in Portsmouth on May 24, 2016, the 75th anniversary of the battle. 8 bells, noon at sea. 1,415 men went down with Hood. They have no graves on land. Divers who have visited the wreck describe what they find among the steel and silt. Pairs of boots standing upright on the seafloor. That is where they are.